rebels attacked two towns in the Central African Republic on Saturday. The attack happened as French warplanes flew over in an apparent attempt to deter an advance on the capital after a disputed election. The attacks on Bouar and Bangui were the latest by a coalition of armed rebels alleged to be backed by former President Francois Bozize. Meanwhile, the United Nations Refugee Agency says recent violence in the Central African Republic has forced more than 30,000 people to flee to neighboring nations. The UNHCR had been helping people return to the country but stopped when rebels launched an offensive in December. Rebels control about two-thirds of the country and have their sights set on the capital, Bangui. Meanwhile, Central African Republic's main opposition coalition has rejected incumbent President Faustin Archange Touadéra's election victory. Earlier this week, Touadéra's government launched an investigation into former President Francois Bozize, whom the government accuses of plotting a coup before last month's elections. Counter-terrorism expert David Otto joins us now via Zoom from Accra in Ghana to elaborate on the worsening situation in the Central African Republic. Mr. Otto, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you very much for having me.
We've seen former President Bozize being at pains denying that he actually plotted a coup, and we've seen incumbent President, President Touadéra and the United Nations say that he's actually responsible. What's the real story here?
I think, that's the story. The story is that, Francois Bozize has denied that he's plotting a coup d'etat. What he's saying is that, his forces, that are rebel leaders, are fighting against a corrupt regime, a regime that is backed, according to Francois Bozize, by mercenaries. I mean, he's referring to the Russians. Of course, the Russians, as I know, I've seen documentations which they've signed a bilateral agreement with the Central African Republic government. Francois Bozize believes that they are mercenaries. But, what began as a rejection by the Constitutional Court for Francois Bozize to run again. Remember, in 2013, Francois Bozize was overthrown by what became, infamous as the Seleka rebels, which was a huge massacre because you had, another faction that was formed against the Seleka rebels known as the anti-Balakas. And, that faction supported Francois Bozize. And the consequence of that, was a very dirty war, which, was very genocidal. Now, what we have now is a president that has come back just a year ago saying that he wants to run again. And the current government of Faustin Touadéra has refused that he couldn't run. Of course, that was done by the Constitutional Court on the basis that Francois Bozize had criminal cases against him for his role that he played during his ousting in 2013. So Bozize has rejected that, and he's now split the rebel factions that have signed the 2019 peace agreement. They are now fighting against the government forces. So this is what is happening at the moment.
You speak of a dirty war, but is it really a religious war between the anti-Balaka and the Seleka, who are, of course, backed by, the Muslim minority there? How would you define this? Is it really, escalating into a religious war?
I think that is the dangerous narrative which one must always avoid. I mean, the war that began in 2013 was quite a dirty one. What is happening now in 2019, 2020, of course, is, it's now a civil war, I can call it, because the rebel groups that have split away from the 14 armed groups, of course, you had the PK5, which, has joined the peace agreement. Some of the rebel groups, were both Christians, and Muslims, and they still are. So what we see now is a strictly political rebel movement, which is bent on changing the regime. Now, there is, the side of the government, which, says that Francois Bozize is backed, by external parties. I mean, a couple of people have named France, but there is no real evidence to show that France is, behind, Francois Bozize. But the question is, where do the rebels get the arms? I mean, a couple of sources have reported that some of the mercenaries, come from Chad and neighboring countries. Remember, Central African Republic is, surrounded by a couple of very fragile countries. DRC Congo, linked with the Lord Resistance Army from Uganda. You've got the borders with Cameroon, which is quite fragile. So, I mean, what we are seeing now, to answer your question directly, is a political rebellion by Francois Bozize, who is saying, if I can't run, in the presidential election, which took place in December the 27th, then, nobody else, will have the country peacefully. So we've got a country that is principally being, there's governance in Bangui, but out of Bangui, there is serious fighting with the rebel groups.
More especially because Mr. Bozize enjoys, huge support from external forces. He enjoys huge support from within the Central African Republic and especially within the army. And of course, he commands support from the Baya, which is the CAR's largest ethnic group. So is this perhaps the clearest indication that he still commands incredible clout, and this tension will still go on as long as he's still interested in clinging on to power?
I think what you've got to take into context is that you cannot underestimate the connections and the power of an ex-president. Bozize was a president before, he was a general. We've seen very many rebel forces that were previously military, what they call the FACA, which is the Force Armée Centrafrique. And a lot of officers have laid down their arms. Some of them have escaped towards the borders with Cameroon, others have joined this movement. So he still has a very huge support, not just within the military, but also, as you mentioned, within his own tribe. Now, the question is whether Bozize himself, can really take power by force. I mean, he has made attempts, by calling on the government to not hold the elections on the basis of insecurity and on the basis that the constitutional decision was very unfair. And we have seen that. In other opposition groups that have called, about 10 of them have said the elections were not free and fair. I mean, that is a very good point because, so many people couldn't vote because of the insecurity. So it's a catch, 24, I mean, in a way that, no elections because of insecurity and insecurity, because of elections. So I think Bozize has a very strong point, in strong position in terms of his background. But it still has to go down to the negotiation table, to be honest.
Now, the Russian military advisors are currently stationed in the country to help train the government forces. And Mr. Otto, what do you make then of Moscow fostering close ties in recent years?
I think what you've got to understand is geopolitics, is there for everyone to take, whether it be Russia or France. I mean, what I do know from contacts on the ground, the reason why Russia came into being in Central African Republic was because the French government had taunted the current president and said, you can rely on Russia if you want, and there they went. And now, Russia is not just training some of the FACA forces, but also Russia is actually very much involved in guarding the president, within the presidential guard. Now, what you also have is a bilateral agreement which has been signed. Russia has deployed, aircraft, is deployed APC, armored vehicles, is deployed about 300 of its soldiers. Now, a lot of people say they are mercenaries, but, that is not what is on paper. Now, there is this accusation that the Wagner group is behind most of the Russian forces that are on ground. But, it's everybody's argument, to put forward. What the government is saying is we have a bilateral agreement which suits our situation, because, of course, you remember that Central African Republic is under an arms embargo. So the government needs to rely on some kind of, an ally. And, Russia has opened up its arms. And, there they are. They've dived straight into that. And, not everybody's happy about that.
Now, these elections have been described as a giant step backward. And, would you say that they have perhaps been the biggest litmus test for the country's democracy?
I think, in my opinion, if I look at the security situation, my advice would have been that you cannot hold elections on the basis of because you want to hold it.
Okay.
The elections were irrespective of the rationale behind the insecurity. It was very clear that a lot of people will be disenfranchised if those elections were being held, which of course the United Nations mission in Central African Republic, MINUSCA, made sure that elections were held. Now this is the blowback. You can have elections and make sure that people in Bangui, and very few people out of Bangui, go to the polling stations and vote. Now, what happens about governance? So, in my opinion, you've got elections that have taken place. The government can do well to control Bangui, but Bangui is not Central African Republic. So, how the government is going to be able to run the country now is a matter for you and I to really think about. But it goes down to show that you can win elections, but taking power is one thing. Governing it is another thing. And that's what we're seeing in Central African Republic at the moment.
And now, Rwanda having sent troops there, what could possibly be Rwanda's interest to that country?
I think, like every other country, Rwanda has always had a very strong, relationship with Central African Republic. The president, Paul Kagame, has always, looked at Central African Republic as a country, as a broader country. Now, the purpose for Rwanda is to try and provide the stability that Central African Republic needs. But no country goes to any other country and deploys its forces, just for free. I think there's always a geopolitical interest there. Now, what that interest is something which nobody really knows. But Rwanda has a very strong interest in Central African Republic, and they work hand in gloves.
All right, Mr. Otto, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.